Well, hello to you all once again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and I hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old school vintage racers. Now, we still have quite a few bikes to feature before the end of 2024, and our next outdoor race event will of course be the Scottish Classic Round 4 event, which will be coming up on the 8th of September. So look out for that particular event, because we will be featuring all of the bikes from around the paddock and of course all of the racing. So that's something to look out for in the future. So coming up next, we're going to take a look at a bike that I actually featured way back in 2018, but since then we've gathered together a few more details about the bike, so we're going to do this updated version of this quite nice looking bike. So let's get into that video now and take a look at Paul Armour's lovely 1980 414 Spanish at Montesa Cappra. So it's been quite a while since we featured a Spanish Montesa here on my channel, so I aim to put that to right straight away here by featuring this very nice 1980 414 Cappra that belongs to Paul Armour. And so this featured bike here of Paul's does have a little bit of history to it, and the bike was originally bought by Paul way back in 1980 when he first saw the machine sitting in the shop window of Harrison's motorcycle dealership in Sedbergh in Cumbria, which later then spurred Paul into returning to the shop sometime later with a bag of cash to purchase the bike. Anyhow, with the £1,200 handed over to Harrison's motorcycle shop, Paul soon loaded up the bike and then headed home. And who would have guessed it that almost 45 years later, Paul still owns and even races the bike, and up to just a few years ago, it was still in this stock, original 1980 condition. But it was then a few years after the bike's initial purchase that Paul then suffered a quite bad winter flood in his area, and unfortunately the Montesa Cappra ended up under 6 foot of flood water, where it then had to be rescued and refloated, whereby it had to then undergo a full strip down and rebuild. And naturally some of the things like the engine components, like bearings and seals, all had to be renewed. But more or less every other original part was refurbished, dried out, and then refitted back onto the bike to try and retain the bike's originality. And these pictures that we're looking at here were all taken back in 2018, which was about 38 years after the bike was first bought brand new. And even now you can see that the bike still is in much the same condition as it was when it was sitting in Harrison's motorcycle shop back in 1980. So as you can see, the chassis on these Cappra 414s was a tubular steel type of construction, which was very strong and surprisingly light for a big bore open class race bike. And it also had this twin spar down tube here at the front, which wasn't just to improve the strength of the front of the frame, but it was also designed to allow the exhaust of that centre port 414 engine to pass through the middle. And here at the back, this Montesa rear swing arm was again a simple box section type of design, but in terms of its strength and operation, as far as I'm aware, I've never actually heard of any issues with regards breakages or weaknesses with the steel constructed items, and at first glance it certainly looks like a well-built component, as of course are most parts on these 414 Montesas. But moving on to our 414's engine, which was a simple piston port two-stroker, which, as I remember, I think pushed out around the 43 or 45 horsepower, which I think wasn't too shabby for a Spanish-built motocrosser of 1980, but of course maybe not as powerful as your 490 Micos or 500 big bore two-strokers, but this Montesa racer's engine certainly had a good spread of usable power, and it was an engine that was quite easily manageable. And here on the transmission side, it was a 4-speed gearbox and your usual wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch that in this case here was still cable operated, because this was still the 1980s. Now, feeding all the fuel into that 414 two-stroke power plant was a Bing 54 carburetor, which, as I remember, I think it was pretty much a stock standard part to fit to these Montesas way back in 1980, and of course the associated plastic airbox as well had a foam type washable air filter inside, but Paul appears to be missing some kind of side panel here from the side of the bike, although maybe he's just removed it to do some maintenance prior to putting the bike out there on the track. But as I said earlier, this bike here has almost all of its original 1980 parts still on it, and this exhaust expansion chamber is still the self-same part that was fitted to the bike when Paul first spied it in Harrison's showroom window way back in 1980, and you can see that it's still in quite good condition and almost ding and dent free even after 38 years of twin shock racing. But this alloy tailpipe here at the rear might not be the original part, although it's certainly stamped as a fresco part with 1983 on it, so this could certainly be a later replacement to what would have been the standard original. And once more, the front suspension legs on our 414 are Italian-made Marzocchi forks, and the bike is still sporting its original Spanish Acront alloy wheels on the front and at the rear as well. Although even more surprising than that, I do remember Paul telling me on the day that I shot these clips that this bike was still on its original Pirelli front tyre, which is not bad mileage considering it's a 38-year-old dirt bike. And here at the back of the bike, more original parts with the bike's rear suspension, although I have to admit I'm not entirely sure of these rear shocks manufacturer. They could maybe even be a pair of Corti Cossos or something similar, but again, these shocks have never ever been dismantled or serviced in 38 years, and at the time I took these pictures, Paul did tell me that these shocks were still working absolutely perfectly. Now, once more, Montesa in 1980 were certainly no different from many of the other off-road motorcycle manufacturers of that time, because almost all of them were beginning to then move away from more expensive alloy or even fiberglass fuel tanks in favour of these much more modern, durable, lighter and cheaper to produce plastic fuel tanks to fit to all of their off-road bikes. And of course the other plus point here is that these plastic fuel cells could be manufactured in almost any colour imaginable, so you can see just why it was a no-brainer for Montesa to make the change. But I have to say, I've never actually had the opportunity to try one of these 414 Cappras, and when you take a look at the seats that were fitted to them, they without doubt certainly have a look of a part that looks to have been quite comfortable. But then again, as I said, I've never actually ridden one myself, and I suppose a 414 Cappra rider might have a slightly different opinion to my own. And also, not surprisingly, here at the rear and up at the front of the bike, our 1980 Cappra still has its original front and rear mudguards, which is something that you don't see every day on one of these old Montesas. And as we move on to the pilot's seat, I've certainly no reason to suspect that these controls are not the original bars and grips and levers and cables that came with the bike in 1980, because they certainly do look all proper and correct for that time period. But you can also see the original alloy levers there, complete of course with the original Montesa rubber lever covers there as well. But certainly, without a doubt, this is a time capsule of a bike, and it's a credit to Paul, who's kept it in this original condition, even after it had been submerged in 6 feet of water and then had to be rebuilt. But you have to remember that this bike was never repainted or restored. It was basically dried out and then all put back together. But of course, not only is it a standard 1980 bike, it's still being raced by Paul after all those years. But that's what the bike looked like in 2018. So if we fast forward another 5 years, this is what the bike looked like in 2023 when it was captured at the famous Helsington Scramble in that year. So as you can see, after 43 years of ownership, there's certainly not been an awful lot of changes made to the old Montesa, and even now Paul's still racing the same bike that he bought from Harrison's bike shop in Sedbergh in Cumbria in 1980. And even now the bike still has its 43-year-old parts all still intact, although I'm pretty sure that Paul's now treated the bike to a brand new front tyre, because I think he certainly got his mileage out of that original. But I suppose the biggest and obvious changes here on the 414's engine, which appears to have lost all of its original black engine coating. So I don't know if maybe some kind of engine rebuild has taken place recently. But the bike has its original expansion chamber and tailpipe still intact, and it appears to be free from any kind of track damage after 40 years, which is quite remarkable, really. And even here, as we go back to the controls department, not much has changed since we filmed the bike back in 2018, because it's still sporting all of its original parts, including the bars and levers and lever covers, although I think an engine kill switch now appears to have been added just as a new safety feature. But normally you find that when guys buy a race bike, they maybe race it for a season or two and then either sell it on or trade it in for the latest motocross rocket ship, and then simply repeat the process as their racing career develops. But Paul's without doubt made from a completely different mould, because he bought this bike brand new in 1980, and he's certainly been faithful to the machine ever since, even when the bike disappeared in 6 foot of water during that flood. But of course, the other interesting thing here is that Paul's continued to race the bike and not even wanted to change it for something that might be a bit faster or handle better. So there must be something about this Montesa that keeps Paul returning to this old twin shocker as his number one go-to machine when he takes part in these classic or twin shock races. Although, having said all that, there was one little thing that I have noticed in this 2023 footage, is that Paul's still not replaced that right-hand side panel next to the airbox, because as you remember, that part was also missing on the bike back in 2018. Now, whether he doesn't actually have the panel or just simply refuses to fit it, I don't know, but it's certainly quite intriguing nonetheless. So at the end of the day, you have to admit this is still a nice looking bike with a little bit of history and an owner who obviously is quite taken with his old Montesa to have held on to it and still be racing it after 43 years of ownership. And as I mentioned, the bike has been stripped down and rebuilt because of its encounter with the water and its submarine imitation, but it was only really all dried out and then put back together and not restored. And so there you have it, a quality Spanish-built dirt bike from 1980. That's a quick look around Paul Armour's superb 414 Montesa Cappra. Okay, so coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at this fantastic 500 CCM belonging to Scottish racer Stuart Rodin. And this is just one of many CCM classics that Stuart has in his collection. So don't forget to subscribe or even hit that like button if these are the kind of videos that you like to watch here on YouTube. But again, thanks for taking the time to watch my content, and until the next time, it's goodbye for now.